A whisper slid beneath a velvet curtain, a jewel vanished without sound, and a long-buried secret stirred once more beneath London's winter fog. In this case, nothing was as it seemed, and every clue led deeper into a theatre of illusion, revenge, and grief too carefully concealed. A single scent, a broken silence, and the quiet return of a man thought lost forever. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was on a crisp evening in mid-January that Holmes and I found ourselves in the glittering heart of London society, attending a charity gala at Claridge's Diamond Salon. Though the invitation had come by way of Lady Wexborough, a distant cousin of my late wife and a patroness of a children's hospital, Holmes had agreed to accompany me with the usual grumbling reluctance he reserved for all social functions. I, for my part, had grown accustomed to the curious balance of pride and frustration that accompanied observing Holmes in the presence of the aristocracy. For while they often dismissed him as a clever eccentric, he never failed to quietly outshine them. The room was resplendent with crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany, its every corner humming with the soft rustle of silk gowns and the clipped voices of baronets, financiers, and the idle rich. I was exchanging polite pleasantries with a former colonel of the 14th Hussars when I saw Holmes pause near the edge of the central gallery. He had bent slightly, not in weariness, but with the hawk-like stillness I'd come to recognize as the prelude to a deduction. At his feet lay a single glove, ivory kid leather, finely stitched and clearly misplaced. He lifted it, turned it once in his hand, and then looked not at me, but at the ceiling, as though a chain of invisible cause and effect were already playing across the theatre of his mind. "What do you observe, Watson?" Holmes asked softly, his tone almost detached. I stepped closer and examined the glove myself. A woman's glove, likely expensive. French, I should think, by the stitching, but beyond that, I confess, I see little. "Indeed," said Holmes with the faintest smile. "It is remarkable how often things are dismissed when they are only half seen." He turned slightly and gestured with the glove toward the nearest table, where a half-burned candle in a silver holder stood. A minute trail of wax had dripped onto the carpet beneath. Note the angle of the wax fall, not natural. The candle was lifted and replaced hastily, and not by staff. The distance of the splash tells us the flame was tilted quickly, perhaps to hide something or see better in shadow. He moved again, this time to a velvet-backed chair where he withdrew, delicately, a bent hairpin lodged between the cushion folds. This pin is of the sort not presently in fashion. Slightly heavier, the lacquer chipped. It belongs, I believe, to a woman of more practical habits than decorative. As he passed back by me, I caught a sudden breath of jasmine. Not the cloying sweetness of cheap perfume, but something rarer, fainter, and warm. Holmes noted my reaction. "You smell it too. Jasmine attar from Damascus, a rare oil, nearly extinct in perfumery. One woman in London still wears it, and she was not, I am assured, invited this evening." He glanced down at the glove in his hand once more. A misplaced accessory, a nervous gesture with the candle, and a scent that whispers of a woman who should not be here. What say you, Watson? Does it not strike you that we are standing not amidst charity, but concealment? I looked about the room with renewed eyes, my former detachment replaced by the familiar thrill of mystery. Holmes's deductions had peeled back the glittering veneer of the gala to reveal something far more intricate and perilous. But who, I asked, wears jasmine attar in this age? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he stepped to the side and lowered his voice, his gaze trained upon a departing figure in pale silk, and a dark cloak, gliding toward the rear corridor. "Lady Persephone Verlaine," he said. The name, though unfamiliar to me, carried with it the weight of scandal, yet unspoken. Holmes's voice bore no malice, but something in his expression told me he did not speak lightly. He continued, "Heiress to the Verlaine diamond fortune, patroness of Eastern antiquities, widowed at 32, and, I dare say, in some distress this evening." I followed his gaze, but the woman was gone, vanished into the velvet-curtained recesses of Claridge's like a character retreating behind the final act. Holmes returned the glove gently to the table and said nothing more. It was clear to me that something had begun. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street, the embers in the hearth still faintly alive, when Mrs. Hudson entered with a small silver tray. Upon it lay a single envelope, thick and cream-coloured, its wax seal broken, as though the sender had sealed it once, then opened it again in doubt. Holmes accepted it without a word, and I saw his brow tighten, almost imperceptibly, as he read. "There is work to be done, Watson," he murmured at last. "Delicate work. From Lady Persephone." Holmes did not reply. Instead, he folded the letter once and slipped it into the inner pocket of his dressing gown. "It seems," he said, "that the scent of jasmine was not the only trace she left behind." It was scarcely 10:30 the following morning when Mrs. Hudson, with the quiet urgency she reserved for only the most unusual callers, ushered a lady into our sitting room. She moved with the poise of high breeding, yet there was something in her gait, a hesitation in the placement of her steps, that betrayed unease beneath the silken exterior. Her hat was broad and adorned with a thin veil of black netting drawn low enough to obscure the majority of her features, though the faint glint of emerald earrings caught the morning light from our windows. "Lady Persephone Verlaine," Holmes said without being introduced. She did not appear startled by the recognition, rather resigned to it, as if such piercing insight was the very reason she had come. She remained standing, her gloved hands clasped before her, the fingers gently entwined in a manner more prayerful than composed. "I was told you would not be surprised to see me, Mr. Holmes." "I am not," Holmes replied, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Though I confess I am curious as to which particular shade of your troubles has driven you here this morning." She seated herself with a slight incline of the head. "It is not often," she said, "that an object disappears in full view of 60 titled guests and leaves no one the wiser, least of all myself." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You refer, of course, to the Verlaine star." Her veil shifted slightly as she nodded. "A diamond passed down through 6 generations, French cut, nearly 40 carats, pale with a hint of blue at the heart. It has always been more than a gem to my family. It was to be the centerpiece of last night's display." "Displayed where?" Holmes inquired. "In a locked vitrine, constructed precisely for the occasion, a gala held in honour of the East London Orphans' Hospital. The star was flanked by 3 smaller pieces from our collection. I checked it personally before the guests arrived. When I returned shortly after midnight, it was gone." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And the vitrine?" "Unbroken, locked. The 3 lesser pieces still inside." "A theft," Holmes murmured. "In plain sight, without violence, and leaving behind everything but the principal jewel. Curious indeed." Lady Persephone's gloved hands shifted in her lap. There was no commotion, no interruption in the music, no sign of distress. Had I not seen it with my own eyes earlier that evening, I should think myself mistaken. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And you informed the authorities?" "I requested that the matter be handled with discretion." A constable from Bow Street has viewed the scene under the pretext of an insurance review, but no report has been filed. I do not wish the matter to reach the papers." There was a pause, heavy with significance. "Because it is not the diamond," Holmes said softly, "but the reason for its disappearance that concerns you." Lady Persephone hesitated, and for the first time, her composure cracked. If only for a moment. From within the folds of her clutch, she withdrew a folded sheet of parchment. It bore no seal, no insignia, only a line scrawled in ink darker than one would expect from modern pens. "The diamond shall never shine again, lest her sins be paid in full." She passed it to Holmes, who took it without comment, studying the handwriting with a surgeon's precision. His eyes flicked across it once, twice. "There is no demand for ransom," he noted. "No. No mention of the object itself by name." "No. And yet you understood it at once." A pause. "Yes." I could not help but study her face in that moment, and though veiled, there was something unmistakably haunted in the posture of her neck, the stillness of her mouth. "May I presume," Holmes said quietly, "that the sins alluded to here do not concern your financial ledgers?" "No," she replied, "they do not." It was the closest admission of guilt I had heard uttered with such grace. Holmes folded the note and set it aside. And though he did not press her further, I felt certain that he had already drawn some preliminary conclusion. It hung between us, a question neither fully formed nor spoken aloud, and it would not be long before its answer stirred from the shadows. Holmes regarded our guest with a composure so absolute it made my own pulse quicken by contrast. He had, over the years, developed a remarkable faculty for drawing out confessions without the crude necessity of asking for them. The silence grew heavy, and Lady Persephone, to her credit, did not flinch beneath it. "Lady Verlaine," Holmes said at last, "do you believe this to be the work of someone who knows you personally?" She lowered her gaze. "I believe it to be the work of someone who once did." There was something in the phrasing, the tense she chose, that struck me as deliberate. A wound, not recent perhaps, but never truly healed. Her voice did not tremble, yet I could see the effort it cost her to remain still. "And should this reach the public," Holmes continued, "what would be the consequence?" Her reply was immediate. "My position would be compromised, the family name ruined. There are those who would seize upon this as proof of decadence. I have enemies, Mr. Holmes, though I have never counted them." To that, Holmes simply nodded. "Then we must ensure this matter is concluded before they learn they had cause to sharpen their blades." When she had gone, leaving behind the faintest trace of jasmine in her wake, I turned to Holmes, who remained seated with the note still in hand. "You intend to take the case?" "I do," he said, folding the parchment once more. "But not, I think, as a detective." I was puzzled. Then, as what? As a man sent to guard something more delicate than property, and infinitely harder to restore once broken. He rose, already reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson, the diamond is only the first veil. Let us see what lies behind the second." We returned to Claridge's the next morning under the guise of representatives from the insurers, a ruse facilitated by a discreet letter from Lady Persephone to the management. The Grand Diamond Salon, now bereft of guests and musicians, appeared almost spectral in its stillness. Chairs stood in rigid rows, the heavy curtains drawn against the pale winter sun, as though the room itself had become a mourner for the vanished gem. Holmes moved with that peculiar stillness I had come to associate with his deepest concentration, a feline grace tempered by forensic precision. He spoke little as we entered, offering only a clipped word to the uniformed attendant who remained on silent duty near the door. The vitrine stood precisely where Lady Persephone had described, its glass unblemished, the ornate brass lock unbroken. The 3 lesser pieces still glimmered within, catching the dull light with a dutiful twinkle, as if unaware that their more precious companion had fled. Holmes examined the lock first, then the hinges, and finally the faint indentations on the velvet lining, all without comment. "Not forced," he murmured at last, "and no sign of substitution. It was the star itself that was removed, with purpose, and by someone who knew exactly what they sought." He paced slowly through the room, pausing at intervals, eyes scanning surfaces invisible to ordinary perception. As he stooped to study the angle of a chair beside the vitrine, I saw him lift his fingers toward a faint smudge, and a glint of interest lit in his eye. Holmes withdrew a small glass vial from his coat and pressed it gently to the back of the velvet chair's armrest. A light touch, barely perceptible, drew from the fabric a dark smudge, scarcely larger than a fingernail. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he asked without turning. I bent to observe, though I knew by now that any insight I might offer would fall short of his own. "Soot, perhaps. From a lamp?" Holmes gave a small shake of the head. "Grease paint, stage quality, black, with a hint of ochre, a blend no longer common in English theatres, worn primarily by performers trained on the continent. Observe the faint shimmer. Not soot, but pigment, and not the sort a noble guest would be likely to carry." "Then someone in disguise?" "More than likely, and if they sat here, it was not for comfort." Holmes's gaze moved upward, then shifted toward the vitrine. From this angle, they could view the case directly without drawing attention. The chair had been moved slightly. A minute calculation, enough to offer a clear line of sight. He straightened and tapped the back of the chair once with his knuckle. "So far, we have subtlety, planning, and theatre. 3 qualities that, when combined, point to a hand both rehearsed and deliberate." He turned, already moving to another corner of the room, as though following a silent stage direction only he could hear. We had nearly completed a full circuit of the salon when Holmes halted abruptly by the farthest corner of the room, a dim recess where few guests would have lingered. There, beneath the hind leg of a mahogany chair, he extracted something so slight I might have mistaken it for a scrap of coloured thread. It was a rose petal, delicate, bruised, and slightly crushed, its blush pink hue veined with streaks of violet. "A flower?" I ventured. "A fragment," Holmes corrected. "More importantly, an orphaned one. It bears no scent consistent with the arrangements provided by the hotel, too heady, too perfumed. And see here," he handed it to me with his forceps. "The petal's edge has been torn, not fallen. It was removed hastily. Perhaps from a corsage. Perhaps, or more intriguingly, from a bloom carried not for ornament, but for ritual. You see, this is a damask rose, cultivated for its aromatic properties, not its visual ones. Popular among theatre patrons in southern France and certain colonies, where botanical traditions remain more esoteric." I studied the petal, struck by how something so slight could possess such weight in his hands. "Do you think it significant?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he looked about the room once more, then toward the wall-mounted mirror and the adjacent display. "There is something absent here," he said at last, "and its absence is louder than the rest." Holmes approached a small alcove near the entrance, a decorative cabinet of inlaid walnut and a rosewood, set with a series of objets d'art. One slot, however, was empty. "Curious," he murmured. "What is missing?" I asked. "A mirror, oval, framed in ivory. There was once a velvet backing. The imprint is still here, faint, but distinct. The hook remains. The mirror was not shattered or replaced. It was removed." "Why steal a mirror?" Holmes did not reply. He was studying the base of the display and the faint drag marks upon the side panel, as if something had been tilted, adjusted, and then righted again. He straightened slowly and glanced about the room with a gaze now darkened by certainty. Not a theft for gain, Watson, he said. A theft for message. I waited for him to elaborate, but he did not. Instead, he walked quietly toward the center of the salon and stood there, perfectly still, as though measuring the stage from an unseen script. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "We are no longer dealing with a thief, my friend. We are dealing with an author." And with that, he turned toward the entrance, already prepared to follow the next line in the narrative that only he could see. Holmes's inquiries next led us to a private breakfast salon at the Langham, where Mr. Archibald Riven, a name I recalled from society pages as a prominent gem collector, agreed to speak with us. He was a narrow-shouldered man of middle years, with fingers perpetually dusted in invisible lint, and a voice that betrayed both refinement and something vaguely reptilian in its precision. "I make no secret," he said, leaning back with his fingers steepled in mimicry of Holmes, "of my admiration for the Verlaine star. A finer stone has not crossed public eyes since the Borgia emerald. That it should vanish under such circumstances, well, it wounds the entire collecting fraternity." Holmes inclined his head. "And you observed the display personally?" "Indeed. I stood no more than 5 feet from it at the height of the evening. I even remarked to Lord Halford that its clarity was so precise one might mistake it for a forgery." His lips curled slightly, as if pleased with his own epigram. "Did you observe anything unusual?" "A man in disguise, perhaps." He paused. "But envy has its own scent, Mr. Holmes, and the air near that case was thick with it." It was a curious statement, one Holmes neither confirmed nor denied, but he noted it down. Later that day, we called upon Captain Reginald Ellicott, a man of striking bearing and immaculate moustache, who greeted us with the military stiffness of one still measuring every visitor as either ally or adversary. He had once, as Lady Persephone's circle suggested, courted her in earnest, a match that had, for reasons undisclosed, come to nothing. "Ellicott," Holmes began with his typical directness, "I understand you were present at the Claridge's affair." "I was, and I left shortly before the incident, if that is your line of inquiry." Holmes merely nodded. "Tell me, did you find the lady in spirits?" Ellicott hesitated, his hands resting too firmly on the arms of his chair. "She was cordial, polished, as ever, but not as I remember her." "In what sense?" "In the sense," he said slowly, "that one may polish silver so fiercely it loses its warmth. She wore perfection as armour, and I suppose I once thought I knew the woman beneath." There was no overt malice in his tone, but something lingered, a quiet bitterness that, in lesser men, had often been precursor to rash action. Holmes asked nothing further, but left the room with a faint furrow in his brow. If Mr. Riven had been cold and Captain Ellicott wounded, Lucien Verlaine was flame barely constrained within human form. We encountered him in his rooms near Cavendish Square, the air thick with cigar smoke, decanters half drained, and the unmistakable scent of bitterness worn like cologne. He greeted us with a sneer. "I assume you're here on behalf of my dear cousin." "Merely seeking clarity," Holmes replied evenly. "You were present the evening of the gala." Lucien poured himself a measure of port. "Present?" "I was paraded. I exist to lend the family a suitably aristocratic profile, and to be spoken about in whispers once I leave. A charming arrangement." "And your views on the diamond?" Lucien laughed bitterly. "The star. A ridiculous bauble, revered only because it stayed in our bloodline longer than most of our honour. I always found it ironic that something so transparent should be surrounded by such opaque behaviour." "You disapprove of Lady Persephone." "She plays a role," he said curtly, "and she plays it well." "Where were you during the disappearance?" "I was in the Eastern Corridor, alone. Not that I expect you to believe me." Holmes remained impassive. And yet I suspect the truth of your whereabouts will surface without effort. Lucien's eyes narrowed. I see. You've already made up your mind. No, Holmes replied. I prefer evidence to emotion. But as we departed, I could not shake the feeling that Lucien's fury was not directed at his cousin alone, but at the circumstances that had cast him in so unfavourable a light. A man cornered by debts, and perhaps by ghosts as well. That evening, seated once more in our sitting room beneath the flicker of gaslight, I found myself restless, the accumulated impressions of our visits weighing upon my thoughts. Holmes had settled into one of his long silences, the kind that could last hours without stirring, and I at last broke it. Holmes, you know I am not easily led by appearances, but in this case, I find it difficult to believe anyone other than Lucien Verlaine could be responsible. Holmes said nothing. He had both motive and opportunity. His debts are widely known, his presence at the gala unsupervised, his disdain for the diamond. It is a straightforward matter. Still, Holmes said nothing. Surely you must concede that he is the most likely suspect. Holmes finally stirred, reached for his pipe, and struck a match with unhurried precision. He exhaled once, then turned to me. You are mistaking the obvious for the inevitable, Watson, a common affliction among detectives of less cautious training. I bristled slightly, but he continued. Lucien Verlaine is precisely the sort of man who looks guilty when he is not. Theatrical, impulsive, and unfortunate. But guilt, real guilt, rarely parades itself so loudly. And if not he, then who? Holmes did not reply. He rose and walked to the window, looking out into the gathering fog. I have often said, he murmured, that illusion is more instructive than transparency. Let us consider for a moment what it would mean for this crime to be an act, and not merely a theft. With that, he returned to his chair, and silence fell again. But it was the silence of thought, not surrender. 3 days after our last visit to Claridge's, a footman arrived at Baker Street bearing a sealed envelope. It was addressed in the same angular hand as the first, and though Holmes showed no outward change of expression upon reading it, I noted the way his fingers tightened slightly around the page. Without a word, he passed it to me. The paper was thick and faintly scented, not with perfume, but with pressed foliage, as if it had been stored among dried flowers. The message inside, however, was stripped of all beauty. Truth is the sharpest cut. No name, no demand. Only that simple, unrelenting phrase, sharpened as if it had been honed by personal grievance. She received it this morning, Holmes said at last, delivered by hand, no witnesses. And she gave it to you without hesitation? She did, but not without fear. The mask is beginning to slip, Watson, not in public, but here. He tapped his temple, where guilt and memory often whisper with equal clarity. I frowned. Then this is no longer simply about the diamond. It never was, Holmes replied, rising. But our adversary now reveals something more telling. They do not seek justice. They seek a wound. Later that same evening, a note arrived via the Yard, hastily written, the paper smudged by an inspector's own hand. Lucien Verlaine had been discovered unconscious in his rooms at Cavendish Square, his breathing shallow and his lips tinged a strange greyish blue. We made haste to the address and found Inspector Dorrington already present, pacing the hall outside the drawing room. He's alive, Dorrington said at once, but only just. We've sent for the physician. The decanter and glass are untouched, save for one. Mr. Holmes, it's a strange one, this. We entered the dimly lit parlour. Lucien lay on the divan, his face ashen and damp with sweat. A crystal tumbler had been knocked to the floor and shattered, but Holmes ignored the broken glass. Instead, he moved directly to a second tumbler on the sideboard. untouched but recently poured, and examined the rim. He drew a strip of litmus from his pocket and dipped it gently in the residue. The paper curled, discoloured, and Holmes gave a quiet sound that was neither surprise nor approval, merely recognition. "Veratrina," he said. Dorrington frowned. "A poison?" Holmes nodded. "Derived from South American flora. Rare. Almost entirely unknown outside of theatrical circles. Used in certain stage traditions to simulate fits of madness or death." I stared. "You mean—" "I mean someone attempted to silence Mr. Verlaine with a poison favoured by illusionists. Which tells us two things, Watson. That our enemy is both patient and practised, and that Lucien, for all his bluster, may have stumbled too close to a truth someone wished buried." By Holmes's request, we paid an unannounced call to the archives of the Royal Dramatic Society the following morning. Tucked behind Charing Cross, the rooms smelled of ageing paper and velvet drapes, and were watched over by a spectacled archivist who, after one glance at Holmes's calling card, ushered us into the restricted catalogues. Holmes requested access to the Stage Poisons Register, a peculiar tome I had not known existed, and began flipping through its entries with swift, practised hands. "There," he murmured, stopping at a page halfway through. "Veratrina, used in the 1870s by one Antoine Morel, a stage illusionist and tragedian of some note, last performed in Paris, then vanished after a maritime disaster off the coast of Lisbon." The photograph beside the entry was blurred but distinct, a man of Mediterranean complexion, sharp-featured, intense-eyed. "Curious," Holmes added, "that one would adopt the tools of a vanished actor to execute a modern crime." He closed the book softly. "Or perhaps," he added, "not so curious at all, if that actor were not as vanished as history insists." Later that day, at Holmes's suggestion, I called once more upon Lady Persephone, ostensibly to return a misplaced glove, but in truth to test the tenor of her mood. She received me in her drawing room, elegant as ever, though the lines about her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "I did not expect you, Doctor," she said, not unkindly, "but your presence is never unwelcome." We spoke at first of trifles, the weather, the increasing press coverage surrounding the gala, until I steered the conversation, gently, toward her earlier life. "You were once engaged, I believe," I said carefully, "to a man of the stage." Her expression froze. "Antoine Morel," I continued. "His name surfaced in some of Holmes's research." For a moment, silence reigned. Then, slowly, she nodded. "It was a lifetime ago," she said, her voice softer than I had yet heard it. "He was bold, brilliant, reckless. I was young, my family disapproved. And he was lost at sea. Yes, or so I was told." There was a pause, charged, uncertain. "And if," I said, "he were not?" She did not answer, but the tremble in her hands and the way her gaze refused to meet mine told me all I needed to know. When I returned to Baker Street, Holmes was already at the fire, his eyes half-lidded, his violin silent upon the table beside him. "She confirmed it," I said quietly. "She knew Morel." "I know," he replied. "You speak of it in your face." "What now?" Holmes turned toward the mantel, retrieving a rose petal he had pressed between glass. It had faded slightly, but the veined blush still lingered. "We have grease paint," he said, "a stage poison, a missing mirror, and a woman caught between memory and scandal. The clues are no longer scattered, Watson. They are converging." "But who?" "I know who," Holmes said simply. "But we have not yet reached the moment when truth can be made safe." "Then what remains?" "A performance," he said. "One final act. The stage is set, the players assembled. All that remains is the cue." And with that, He moved to the window, peering out into the city below, as though awaiting the curtain's rise. It was a grey, biting morning when Holmes, with telegram in hand, rapped twice on the sill with the back of his hand and turned to me. "A minor gem has vanished from the South Kensington Museum," he said with an odd gleam in his eye. "The mirror topaz, unremarkable in value, but of great interest in context." Context. Holmes did not reply at once, but moved to his writing desk, where he had, over the preceding days, compiled a chart of gallery holdings, gala invitations, and watchman patrol times with the obsessive neatness of a chess master sketching gambits in ink. "It was placed there by the Yard," he said, "at my request. A decoy." I stared. "Then you expected a second theft?" "I hoped for it," Holmes corrected. "We are not dealing with a common thief, Watson. We are dealing with a dramatist, and he must be coaxed to overplay his hand." "But why the museum?" Holmes placed the telegram carefully aside. "Because it was public, but not ostentatious. Safe, but symbolic. Whoever took the star is not after riches. He wishes to make an impression. The mirror topaz was bait, and he has taken it." He straightened his coat. "Now it is our turn to write the next scene." That evening, Holmes met with Inspector Dorrington in the private box of the Royal Opera House. The performance was to be Carmen, though Holmes confessed little admiration for Bizet. "Far too much sentiment," he muttered, as he arranged the components of the trap. The plan, as outlined by Holmes, was characteristically precise. A replica of the Verlaine star, fashioned from glass and set in a near-perfect mounting, was to be worn by Miss Celeste Halberd, an actress in service to the Yard for such theatrical ruses, who would attend the gala charity performance that night. Her attire, an opulent gown of blue silk, would bear the necklace prominently. In attendance would be a host of London's elite, including Lady Persephone Verlaine herself. "There will be 3 plainclothes constables posted in the orchestra," Holmes explained. 2 more near the vestibule. I shall observe from the upper gallery. Your men must be ready, but restrained." "And the lady?" I asked. "She knows nothing," Holmes said. "Nor must she. The illusion must be complete." I found myself troubled by the coldness of the plan, though I knew Holmes had learned long ago that sentiment was the enemy of strategy. "Do you truly believe he will strike again?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "He has already begun to unravel. The moment he believes he is authoring the finale, he will step from the wings. That is when we must be waiting, not as critics, but as historians of truth." I took my position in the same gallery row as Lady Persephone Verlaine. She was radiant in appearance, but distant in expression, her eyes fixed on the stage with the intensity of one who hears music only dimly, through the echo of deeper thoughts. She wore no diamonds that night, save for a modest brooch at her collar. Yet still she turned heads, not for splendour, but for the solitude she carried like a veil. Between us sat 2 other guests, whom I suspected Holmes had placed deliberately. I watched them shift slightly at intervals, though their attention never left the orchestra pit. The faux Verlaine star, worn by Miss Halberd several rows down, shimmered beneath the gaslight. I saw no sign that anyone else had taken particular notice. And yet, I could not rid myself of a growing unease, a sense that somewhere in the house, beneath the gilded ceilings and velvet balconies, eyes far sharper than mine were already watching. Lady Persephone stirred only once, when the curtain lifted. And then, as the music began, her gloved hand tightened against her seat. Something, I felt, was already in motion. The first act concluded with thunderous applause, and the house came alive with murmurs of admiration and the rustle of silk. I rose with the crowd, keeping close to Lady Persephone, though her attention was already drifting elsewhere. Her gaze fixed not upon the stage, but on the exit toward the vestibule. Then, a scream. It was not theatrical. It rose sharply from below, followed by gasps, then shouts. All at once, the crowd surged forward, and I caught sight of Miss Halberd crumpled near the stairwell, her hand clutching at her chest. "The necklace!" someone cried. Within moments, a pair of constables were at her side. I descended rapidly, pushing through the confusion to kneel beside her. She was pale, but breathing. Stunned, not wounded. "The chain," she whispered. "He took the chain, just before I fainted." "And did you see?" "No face," she gasped. "A glove, a touch, nothing more." The necklace, or its false counterpart, was indeed gone, torn free in the fray. I looked about, but there was no sign of the assailant. No figure darting through the crowd, no shadowed silhouette vanishing behind the curtains. It was, I realized, a ghost of a theft, a crime half performed and yet wholly real. And Holmes was nowhere to be seen. I searched the crowd for a glimpse of Holmes's angular form, but he had vanished utterly. Dorrington's men were already moving through the exits, securing the vestibules, but their expressions betrayed more confusion than confidence. Then I saw it. A theatre programme left on the ledge of our upper box. Holmes's box. It had been folded once and placed precisely where he knew I would look. I opened it, and inside, in Holmes's thin, unmistakable hand, was a single word: pursuit. There was no signature, no further instruction, only that solitary word, a signal both final and urgent. I returned to Lady Persephone, who by now had risen from her seat. She looked at me with wide, unreadable eyes. "Is it finished?" she asked quietly. "I believe," I said, "that it has only just begun." The crowd continued to churn and speculate, but I knew Holmes had moved beyond the theatre now, not to watch, but to act. Whatever he had seen, whatever thread he had followed into the shadows, he had done so alone. And I could only hope that he had done so in time. It was not until the small hours of the morning that the familiar tread of Holmes's boots echoed upon the Baker Street steps. I had remained awake, restless, and in some degree of suspense, uncertain whether he would return at all, or whether this strange case had led him at last beyond even his formidable reach. He entered quietly, and with him came another, a man of medium height, wrapped in a dark overcoat, and with a silk scarf drawn high over the lower part of his face. He walked stiffly, yet not under duress, rather with the bearing of one who knows that resistance is no longer useful. Holmes offered no greeting. He merely nodded in my direction and gestured toward the hearth. "He will speak," he said, "but not yet." The man took the seat Holmes indicated and said nothing. He neither removed his gloves nor unwrapped the scarf that obscured his features. Yet there was something unmistakably theatrical in his stillness, a deliberate poise, as if each movement were weighed for its dramatic effect. Holmes shed his coat, seated himself, and steepled his fingers. "You have written many acts, monsieur," he said softly, not looking at the man. "Let us see, at last, whether you can deliver a curtain." The man did not respond, but his shoulders, beneath the heavy wool, drew slightly inward. Holmes rose and walked to the silent man, who sat as though sculpted from stone. Then, with a single smooth gesture, he reached for the scarf and drew it away. The face beneath was not the one I expected. The features were marred by time and suffering. A network of pale scars crept along the left jaw, crossing upward toward the cheekbone. His nose, once finely cut in the French manner, had been broken and reset. The eyes, though, were unmistakable. Fierce, expressive, alive with a kind of burning restraint I had seen only in men hardened by isolation and obsession. Antoine Morel, Holmes said aloud, his voice devoid of triumph. Or what remains of him. The man did not blink, but a long, slow breath passed through his nostrils. You should be dead, I said before I could stop myself. He looked at me then, and there was neither malice nor pain in his expression, only a kind of theatre-weary fatigue, as though the part he had played had grown too large to carry any longer. Death, he murmured, his voice rasping like old curtains drawn across a dark stage, is often a matter of agreement. I chose silence. Holmes returned to his chair. Not silence, monsieur, he said, only a change in script. Holmes, seated once more with fingers laced, began to recount the journey which had led us to this man, not for my benefit, but perhaps for Morel's, as though to compel confession through precision alone. 10 years ago, Holmes began, you were performing at the Théâtre de Minuit in Paris. Your final performance, Le Visage de Minuit, ended not with applause, but with flame, an explosion beneath the stage, a fire of mysterious origin. You were said to have been among the dead. Morel did not speak, but the faintest tremor passed through the corner of his mouth. Your body was never recovered. The sea, they said, had taken it. I looked at Holmes. Then he boarded a steamer under an assumed name the same night, Holmes continued. Presumed dead, he travelled east, Corsica, Smyrna, Tangier, learning, watching, waiting. The stage was behind him, but the theatre remained. Holmes turned to Morel. You did not drown in salt water, monsieur, but you drowned all the same, in bitterness, in exile. You lost more than a face that night. You lost an audience. A silence fell, not cold, but heavy. Morel looked into the fire. She left me, he said simply. No, Holmes corrected. She was made to leave you. The actor closed his eyes. And that, Holmes finished, is the first line of your final act, not of tragedy, but of vengeance. Holmes rose and began to pace, the rhythm of his movements now echoing the measured cadence of reason. The candle wax, he said, was the beginning. An amateur would not know the angle of the drop, nor that it pointed to a hand unfamiliar with the room's layout. But you, Monsieur Morel, did not move in ignorance. You staged a scene. He gestured toward the pressed rose petal beneath glass on the mantel. The damask rose, crushed beneath a chair never used by any guest. An actor's flourish, a relic tied to your earliest performances in Algeria, where the rose was used as ritual prop. Holmes's voice remained even. And the mirror, removed, not broken. For what is illusion, if not the bending of reflection? You took it not to conceal your presence, but to prove it. A message to Lady Persephone, a symbol of fractured memory. He turned slowly toward the chair where Morel sat. The grease paint on the velvet, ochre and black, unused in this country for over a decade. Yet I found it on your gloves. And the poison, Veratrina, sourced from the wardrobe of illusion, used not to kill, but to terrify. Holmes returned to the hearth and stood in silence. You did not come to steal, he said. You came to haunt, to become the ghost she was never allowed to mourn. Morel said nothing, but his eyes, for the first time, filled with something like grief. For several minutes none of us spoke. The fire crackled gently, and outside, the first hint of dawn brushed against the curtains. At length, Holmes stepped away from the hearth and stood before Morel, not as a policeman nor an accuser, but as a man addressing another who had lost more than justice could repair. You did not seek wealth, he said. The Verlaine star has not been fenced, nor even moved. It remains, hidden, yes, but untouched, because it was never your object. Morel looked up. You wish to humiliate her, Holmes continued, to draw her into scandal, to make her name a subject of whispers, her reputation hollowed, as yours had been. You did not want her fortune. You wanted her sorrow. Morrel's voice came then, thin but unwavering. I wanted her to feel absence. Holmes did not flinch. You wanted her to grieve what she never buried. You were robbed of death, and so you made your return the wound. There was no rage in Holmes's tone, only precision, and perhaps something beneath it I had never heard before, the faintest breath of sorrow. Yet you miscalculated, Holmes said at last. She did mourn. Not as you expected, perhaps, but with silence and duty. The only refuge left to a woman bound by title and expectation. Morrel said nothing more, and as Holmes turned from him, I knew the case had reached its end. Not with the clang of irons, but with a man sitting in the ruins of his final act. The drawing room of Scotland Yard, rarely used, and even more rarely dignified by silence, was given over that afternoon to a peculiar scene, not an interrogation, nor yet a formal statement, but something altogether quieter and more dangerous. Lady Persephone entered without hesitation. She wore no veil this time, no mask of silk or society. Her bearing was upright, her gloves unremoved, her composure intact, though I, who had watched her closely these many days, could sense the tremor she carried beneath that outer calm. Antoine Morel sat already within, unshackled but under guard. He did not rise when she entered, nor did she falter upon seeing him. The two figures, once entangled in affection, now severed by time, silence, and tragedy, regarded one another not as enemies, but as echoes of what might have been. Holmes stood near the window, arms crossed, silent. It was Lady Persephone who spoke first. I thought you dead. Her voice did not waver. Morel's gaze met hers. You buried me, he said softly, with your silence. She flinched slightly, a motion so minute it might have passed unnoticed. No, she replied. I was made to forget you, and I obeyed. That is my guilt. In that room, with the gaslight dimmed and the constables dismissed to the far corners, it was not justice that was weighed, but sorrow. Lady Persephone took a seat opposite Morel, and there was a long silence before she spoke again. I wrote you, she said. 6 letters, perhaps 7. I do not remember if I sent the last. They were intercepted. I learned later. Never delivered. My father forbade them. He told me you had disgraced the family, that you had chosen disgrace over decency. Her voice was steady, but the stillness of her hands betrayed the effort that steadiness required. Morel blinked slowly. I received nothing, not even word of your mourning. There was no public mourning, she replied. How could there be? We were not betrothed by name. We were not recognized. I was forbidden to speak of you, even to my own brother. I wore black beneath my gowns. I mourned in silence in the only way I could. A pause, and then she continued, softer now. I watched the theatre pages year after year, waiting for some trace of your name to reappear. I believed you had drowned, or died in some distant place, and still I waited. He looked at her with something unplaceable in his gaze, not forgiveness, nor fury, only exhaustion. I became the ghost you expected, he said at last, and then I became the actor who could haunt you. Persephone's hand moved to her brooch, the only jewel she now wore. It was small, unremarkable, but I saw how tightly she held it. I never stopped remembering you, she whispered, even when I could no longer speak your name. Morel shifted in his chair, and though his voice remained low, the bitterness within it now lacked its earlier sharpness. I lived in shadow, he said, not merely out of necessity, but out of rage. I believed you had cast me aside for wealth, for inheritance, for position. that I was a stepping stone to something grander, to what you became. His eyes found hers again. And perhaps I wanted to believe it. Hatred is easier to bear than heartbreak. Obsession is easier than grief. She said nothing. I shaped my new life with care, he continued. I learned to vanish in cities where names had no meaning. I wore 100 faces, but every mask I donned led me back to yours. I thought, if I could not undo the silence, I would answer it with spectacle. He laughed once, dry, joyless. The thefts, the poison, the notes, all theatre, all performance. I wanted your world to burn as mine had burned. But now, he faltered. Now I see a woman who survived her own ruin, who was ruined in silence, as I was, not by choice, but by the demands of names neither of us chose. He leaned forward. Do you hate me? She shook her head slowly. No. The silence that followed was deeper than anger, and infinitely more terrible. For the first time, I pitied him. It was Holmes who broke the silence, speaking not with the precision of the investigator, but with the quiet gravity of the man who sees clearly and judges cautiously. There is a cost, he said, to both vengeance and silence. Neither leaves the soul unmarked. Neither Morrel nor Lady Persephone turned to him, but I knew they listened. Holmes rarely offered reflection unbidden. When truth is buried, he continued, it does not remain still. It shifts, decays, and blooms into something else. Suspicion, hatred, obsession. You both were wronged, yes, but in your attempts to correct injustice, you wounded others, and yourselves, more deeply. He turned toward Morrel. You made a stage of a woman's grief. You punished her for a silence she was not permitted to break. Then to Lady Persephone. And you allowed guilt to become penance, when only truth might have cleansed the wound. He stepped back. This is not the end of justice, but perhaps it may be the end of tragedy, if either of you can bear to let it rest. They said nothing, but the air between them shifted, no longer sparking with pain, but subdued by its aftermath. They sat for a time longer, speaking no further, and I cannot say what passed in that silence. Perhaps some fragment of absolution, or merely the resignation of two souls too weary to rage. Holmes gave a quiet signal, and the constables reappeared. Morrel rose without resistance. He did not look back. Lady Persephone remained seated, her eyes upon the empty chair across from her. The gaslight flickered above her, catching a glint from the brooch at her throat. The smallest jewel, and perhaps the truest. As Holmes and I stepped out into the corridor, I looked back once through the open doorway. She had not moved. The past, I thought, had not been defeated, but perhaps at last it had been named. The night drew long and cold as we returned to Baker Street. Holmes said nothing on the journey. He was not prone to needless speech at the best of times, but there was a particular quietness about him that night. Not of fatigue, but of settled resolution. We entered our sitting room. The fire had burned low, reduced to a faint orange glow amidst the blackened coals. Holmes took his accustomed place by the hearth and reached silently for his pipe. I did not disturb him. There was a rhythm in the stillness, a pause between storms. At length, he drew a breath and lit the pipe with a single match. The sharp scent of tobacco drifted through the room. And so, he said, the mask is dropped and the curtain falls. I waited. In Holmes's world, endings were never abrupt, only revelations delayed by silence. He spoke as if tracing the memory aloud, not for his own benefit, but as one does when assembling the scattered pages of a well-acted play. The grease paint was the first true whisper, he said. Its blend, ochre with a binder of almond oil, is no longer used in modern English theatre. But in certain French circles, particularly among illusionists, it remains traditional. Crude for close work, but brilliant for distance and perfect for disguise. He leaned back, his voice steady. The rose was rarer still. A damask hybrid, cultivated in only 3 London greenhouses, one of which sells exclusively to costumers at the Royal Dramatic Society. It was not carried for ornament, Watson, but to conjure memory, theatrical memory. I nodded slowly. It wasn't a theft, it was a production. Exactly. From the absent mirror to the stage poison, every detail was choreographed. Morel did not want to vanish. He wanted to reappear, and not as himself. He wished to become something larger, a myth. A reckoning. Holmes tapped his pipe once against the ashtray. When a man rehearses his revenge for 10 years, Watson, he does not improvise. Lucien Verlaine, Holmes continued, was never more than a pawn, though an unwittingly perfect one. He rose, walking slowly to the sideboard, where he poured himself a measure of brandy, not out of indulgence, but habit. The soft clink of glass marked the moment before he resumed. His debts, his disdain, his volatile temper, all authentic, which is precisely why they were useful. Morel required a shadow to stand in, and Lucien offered one large enough to draw all suspicion. "You saw that from the start?" I asked. "I saw it," he said, "but I did not believe it. Not then." He sipped once, then set the glass aside. The rage of a man like Lucien is noise. The rage of a man like Morel is theatre, quiet, controlled, devastating. Lucien flared, shouted, stumbled. Morel wrote roles for others to play. Holmes turned back to me. The true trick was that Morel never appeared until the final act. All else, the thefts, the letters, the poisoning, were dress rehearsals. Lucien was merely cast in the wrong part. And we followed the script he wrote. Holmes nodded once, until we turned the page. Holmes returned to his chair, folded his hands beneath his chin, and spoke with the kind of soft inevitability that accompanies only the firmest truths. Morel planned every scene. First, the gala. Not for wealth. No, he left the lesser gems untouched. He needed only the star, a symbol, not a prize. He timed its removal to coincide with the height of the music and a subtle shifting of chairs. No one would notice. That was the beauty of it. He gestured vaguely with his pipe. Then came the letter, the first of many. Its phrasing was deliberately archaic, cryptic. Not a ransom, but a threat dressed as poetry. It was meant to unnerve, to summon memory, not just for Lady Persephone, but for the world she inhabited. The poisoning? I asked. Another act, not fatal, but startling. The toxin was measured precisely, enough to incapacitate, never to kill. Morel did not seek blood, Watson. He sought collapse, reputational, emotional. Lucien was his puppet, a noisy one, but effective. Holmes leaned forward. Each clue was theatrical, every gesture calculated. He played upon guilt and silence, using absence as his monologue. But in the end, it was his presence that betrayed him. "And the performance?" I said. Holmes smiled faintly. It was flawless, until the audience saw through the illusion. For a time, Holmes smoked in silence. Then, as if compelled by some rare honesty, he spoke more softly. "I suspected Morel long before we met him," he said. "But suspicion is not proof, and proof alone is insufficient when the matter touches the heart." He looked toward the hearth where the flames had now nearly faded to embers. If I had accused him outright, the mask would have fallen, yes, but so too would the opportunity for understanding. For justice to land without compassion, Watson, is to miss its mark. I regarded him carefully. "So you waited?" "I waited," he confirmed, "for the moment when emotion met evidence. When Lady Persephone could face him not as a criminal, but as a memory unfinished. He tapped out the last of his pipe. It is not always the intellect that resolves a case. Sometimes it is the willingness to listen, to allow the silence to speak. Outside, the wind had risen, brushing against the panes. And in that stillness, I realized that Holmes, for all his detachment, had not merely solved the case. He had understood it. The hour had grown late, and London outside lay muffled in fog. A soft stillness wrapped itself around Baker Street, as though the city itself had drawn a breath and resolved not to speak it. Holmes and I sat as we so often had after the closing of a case, the fire reduced to embers, the decanter between us barely disturbed, and the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound in the room. Holmes, cross-legged in the armchair, held his brandy glass with a relaxed grip. His eyes, though half-lidded, did not convey sleepiness. Rather, they held that peculiar gleam which accompanied the quiet withdrawal of the intellect once its work was done. The chessboard cleared, the final piece returned to its box. I sat opposite, my own mind adrift in recollection. The faces of Lady Persephone and Antoine Morel lingered before me like phantoms on a stage gone dark, and I could not help but feel that though the curtain had fallen, the drama was not yet fully exhaled from the room. We had resolved the puzzle. That much was certain, but as the wind tapped faintly at the glass, I found myself asking whether truth alone ever truly closed a wound. At last, I spoke. Not to disturb Holmes's reverie, but because the question had taken root and could not be left to grow unspoken. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe justice was served?" He did not answer immediately. The fire cracked once, then resumed its fading glow. "We uncovered the culprit, yes," I continued. "We prevented disgrace. We unearthed the motive, and yet I cannot help but feel that something remains unfinished. Not fact, but feeling." Holmes lifted his gaze slightly. "You refer to the matter of vengeance." "Yes," I said. "Vengeance and silence. Both were wounds in this case, and neither, I think, has truly healed." Holmes swirled the contents of his glass once, then set it aside untasted. "Justice, Watson," he said slowly, "is a blade we are asked to wield on behalf of truth. But truth, once exposed, does not always restore. Sometimes it only reveals what has already been broken beyond mending." I nodded, though a heaviness remained within me. "Then do we call the case closed?" "Only in the eyes of the law," he said. "Not, I think, in the hearts of those who lived it." Holmes rose then and moved toward the window. The pane was cold beneath his hand, and he traced it absently with one finger, not to clear it, but to mark its condensation as though it were some ephemeral page. "There are wounds, Watson," he said, his voice low, "that justice cannot heal. Only truth can lay them bare. But even truth, I fear, cuts deep." I watched him, struck not by the words themselves, but by the weight with which they were spoken. Holmes, the ever-rational, the unwavering blade of deduction, now stood in the presence of something not calculable, the consequences of grief. Morel was not a villain in the traditional sense, he continued. He did not seek gold, nor even vengeance in its crudest form. What he wanted was acknowledgement, a recognition of his pain from the one who had been forced to forget him. He turned then, and his eyes met mine. And Lady Persephone, she too suffered, silenced by propriety, condemned by her station to mourn without name or right. What passed between them in that room was not guilt and punishment. It was a shared ghost, finally named. I could say nothing. Holmes resumed his seat. "We uncovered the mechanism, Watson, but some truths are not clocks to be disassembled. They are echoes." And the room fell silent again, the fire reduced to a mere suggestion of warmth. I found my mind drifting in that quiet, not to the crime itself, but to its shape, Its symbolism, the stolen gem, the letters, the disguises. They were props in a drama none of us had written, yet all had played a part within. In the end, I said, it was all theatre. Holmes's eyebrow lifted slightly. Not merely by the hand of an actor, I continued, but by all of us. We wear masks, Holmes, not always to deceive, but to endure. Society demands roles of the heiress, the suitor, the cousin, the detective, the doctor. Each of us is cast before we choose our lines. Holmes tapped his pipe lightly against the arm of his chair. Then you suggest the stage was not confined to Covent Garden? Precisely, I replied. It extended to Claridge's, to Cavendish Square, to Baker Street, even to Scotland Yard. The only difference between Morel and the rest of us was that he chose to write the ending. Holmes nodded once, and nearly succeeded in making us believe it. We sat a while longer, and I realized that what disturbed me was not the drama we had uncovered, but how easily we had been absorbed into its illusion. The fire had at last gone out, and the hour crept toward dawn. Holmes had not spoken for some time, and I found my own thoughts ebbing into silence. I rose, crossed the room, and gently extinguished the lamp. There was something solemn in the act, as though lowering the lights not only upon the room, but upon the memory of what had passed. A vanished jewel, a reappearing ghost, a woman made to forget, and a man who could not. Holmes remained seated, his gaze distant. And as I turned to leave, I cast one final glance at the shadows upon the wall. The case of the diamond salon was closed, but its sadness, like a faint scent of jasmine in the air, lingered. As we sat in the waning light of our Baker Street parlour, Holmes stirred from his silence and said, "It is curious, Watson, how a man may disappear more completely in grief than he ever could by deception. Morel did not vanish at sea. He was drowned long before in the silence forced upon two hearts by pride and expectation." He tapped out the ashes from his pipe, his gaze distant. "The tragedy, my dear friend, was not in the theft, but in the years both lived as ghosts." What do you think was the most pivotal clue Holmes followed? The grease paint, the crushed rose, or something else hidden in plain sight? And what do you believe was Morel's greatest mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your deductions. And if you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes stories and pass this tale along to a fellow detective mind. The game's never truly over, not while mysteries remain unsolved.